Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sink, and welcome to a brief lecture focusing on social sensitivity and empathy. In this lecture, we'll take a look at how our cultures affect our worldviews and biases, and also look at empathy as a communication strategy for building bridges across difference. So it's often effective to start with building our awareness of how our own culture has guided our communication behavior. Now, I'm specifically addressing this through a US American lens. So, how often do we think that our approach is the best approach, or maybe even the only approach to thinking, communicating, learning, performing, and engaging? When really, if we took a longer or more global view, it's simply one way of doing those things. In many cases, actually, our way can get in the way of becoming a more socially sensitive, empathetic, and emotionally intelligent person who can navigate with others through complex issues. Now, US American students are often praised for succeeding in their academic careers because they have been socialized to be assertive, independent, active listeners who are not afraid to ask difficult questions and push themselves hard to deliver an outstanding final product. However, taking advice from an intercultural communication textbook, this advice might be a good next step. You must now unlearn all this socialization and resist the temptation to share every great thought or idea and instead switch into listener mode. When we look across to our dialogue partners that may have different cultural experiences, we might believe that we say easy fixes to their social issues and concerns, when really they are complicated problems embedded in complex systems that take slowing down, listening, and intentional empathetic communication strategies to get a hold of. So let's look at a different way to understand how our cultures socializes when it comes to our communication behavior. So let's dive in and take a look at the concept of worldview. So as you can see on your slide, worldview, underlying assumptions about the nature of reality and human behavior. What we know is that worldviews are not universally the same across nations and cultures. So I wanted to show a way that this varies between cultures, again, as an attempt to become aware of your own influences, especially on your communication behavior. So I want to introduce a measure where we're looking at individualist versus collectivist cultures. This is simply a measure of how a culture is oriented towards individual needs or group needs. So individualist cultures means that individual choices and decisions are expected among its people. They value personal space, autonomy, privacy, freedom, and the right to express themselves verbally and emotionally. These folks tend to express themselves both positively and negatively more spontaneously in public or in private, and communicating both positive and negative emotions is appropriate in close relationships and seen as necessary for forming close bonds. On the other side, collectivistic folks conceptualize themselves within groups that they're a part of, and they generally know their place in life determined socially within that group. These folks value harmony among people and between people and nature. They value togetherness, loyalty, tradition, and emphasize the needs of the collective over the needs of the individual. Extended family is very important. And generally, an expression of negative emotions, such as anger, is likely to be perceived as a threat to the harmony of the group. Now, this is just one example of how cultural values, norms, and conventions affect people's worldviews and how they behave. You can see how difficulties could arise and misconceptions can happen if we are in a dialogue with someone who approaches life from a different worldview, such as being more individualist or collectivist in your cultural orientation. Social sensitivity is possible through awareness of, of these invisible cultural values then. Not surprisingly, US America is rated highest on individualism, followed by Australia, England, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Italy, and France. Again, it's not easy to become aware of these strong cultural values because they are ubiquitous. They're all around us and they're rarely visible until we use another culture as comparison. So let's dive in and apply worldview to one's biases. So we're going to take a look at biases that we hold individually about ourselves and about others, as well as cultural biases. Beliefs and biases are often regarded in your mind as truth or facts about a situation. And in reality, they're thoughts you have been thinking and emotions that you've been feeling over and over again. They're strong opinions at best, but they aren't necessarily right or wrong. As we know, our biases live in our brains. Most people live on autopilot. This is because our neural pathways operate underneath the premise of the path of least resistance. The most well-worn path is the strongest and easiest to travel. In the case of belief or bias, the more we confirm these thoughts, act on them, the more ingrained they become. Habits are helpful in the case of driving a car, mastering a work skill, or learning a computer program. However, they can be highly limiting when applied to our relationships, our self-concepts, and our biases. They are based on experiences from your past. For instance, if you grew up with parents who weren't very physically affectionate to one another, you may have developed a belief or a bias that displaying public affection is inappropriate. It's not how couples should act. As you get older and you begin to date, you may notice feeling uncomfortable when your partner tries to put their arm around you, hold your hand, or kiss you in public. You may not even be sure why you feel so uncomfortable, but in your mind you believe it's wrong and improper to be affectionate in public. And this may cause you a lot of tension in your relationships. Increasingly, once a belief is in place, you spend a lot of your time defending it. This is because of the biological bias that prioritizes self-preservation, which translates into being right. So let's talk about how this relates to your biases. I'd like to highlight a few different biases that may affect our social sensitivity and our proclivity to extending empathy to others. So this bias is called fundamental attribution error, and it's centered in our personal identity regardless of culture. In short, with this bias, we allow ourselves more slack to make mistakes based on a given situation than we would on a stranger. So let me give you a brief example. You're stopped at a stoplight and you are behind someone who's obviously distracted. They might be texting on their phone. When the light turns into a green arrow, they don't go. You get frustrated and finally honk your horn and they realize their error, give you a wave, and you both move on. And you are left thinking as you drive on, what an idiot. I'm surrounded by bad drivers. Everyone is distracted. It's not safe because of drivers like that, or so on. Then, the next day, you find yourself in that same position, but you've switched roles. So now you are the distracted driver, texting home about a grocery list, perhaps, when the light turns and you don't notice it and you hear a honk. You apologize by waving and move on, and you might think to yourself as you drive on, wow, I've had a rough day. I would have been more focused on driving if I had a better night's sleep last night, etc. So essentially, this bias pushes us at a default level to grant ourselves and those we know and love, our tribe, if you will, to be and to allow them to be more complex individuals, to take situations and context into account, while at the same time flattening the other person, the stranger, to a less complex human, which allows us less room to extend empathy to them. So in essence, others make errors that the other make is due to the type of person that they are. So they do bad things because they're a bad person. But for us, errors that I make are due to the situation that I am in or the context. So I'm having a bad day, so I acted rudely. So we looked at how the fundamental attribution error allows us to give the gift of complexity to ourself and those part of our tribe, but oftentimes gives a more flattened or incomplete story of another person. Let's next look at a type of bias that we carry around that shapes how we feel about ourselves and then of course affects our communication with others. So our own self-talk is influenced by what we'll mention here as a mental schema. Tara Bennett Goldman refers to a schema as a fundamental belief that many people have about themselves that affect their interpretation of events and governs their behavior. So this is essentially the lens that you see yourself through. Just like fundamental attribution error, just like worldview, oftentimes these things are fairly invisible to us. And being part of a dialogue with an authentic self requires us to be more aware of the baggage that we're carrying around. And also, as you're learning about this, realize that everyone around you is carrying similar biases and has different worldviews as well. So examples of some schemas might be abandonment, your ongoing fear that people will leave you, or mistrust. On the bottom line, people are not trustworthy. Unlovability, the feeling that you are somehow flawed. Exclusion, the belief that you just don't belong. Catastrophizing, spinning ordinary fears into an escalation that makes them out of control. Perfectionism, feeling like nothing you do is good enough, or entitlement, the belief that you can do whatever you want and laws and rules and social conventions are only for others. Now this is not an conclusive list. There are many others, but good examples of schemas. Again, the beliefs that we have about ourselves. So if we are walking around with these mental schemas, we're looking through these lenses, when we're feeling these ways, we're going to find justification for them everywhere. So if you are looking through a schema of abandonment and someone doesn't show up to a meeting on time, you'll find that proof and that will be reinforced, that will uphold that. And this also, of course, affects our communication with others. We might be more or less robust. We might show more or less confidence based on our own self-talk or schema. So if we're looking at this through the lens of social sensitivity, we don't see things as they are oftentimes. We see them as we are. Becoming aware of our own lenses then, or self-talk or schemas, helps us to be more intentional about how we walk through the world and genuine in our dialogue with others. Here's that quote again. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So the last bias I'll share with you is called implicit bias, and this may be a term that you've heard of before or not. But before I describe implicit bias, let me lay some groundwork for understanding how this type of bias works. So we talked about how biases live in our brains, and they are made up of neural pathways that we have reinforced again and again. One way to understand that type of neural pathway is to learn about the concept of heuristics. So A heuristic technique is any approach to problem solving or learning that employs a practical method for sufficient reaching of an immediate goal. So we're talking about speed here. Okay, so what we're creating are mental shortcuts. So essentially we don't need to relearn about something over and over again. We can learn what a table is, and it's reliable. When we see a different kind of table, we'll know the characteristics of table. They're mental shortcuts that make it easy on our brain power. What comes into bias and what makes it a tricky type of thing then is when we put this heuristics into applying it to people or groups of people. So representative heuristics is when we make quick decisions based off of what we can very quickly gather about someone's appearance or the sound of their voice or how they act in a particular context. And we can also bring in some of our past experience, whether that's real or it's been mediated through film and television. And oftentimes what this results in and what it reinforces are stereotypes, which are essentially incomplete stories or generalizations that we have about groups of people. And they're often based off of physical traits such as ethnicity, hair color, body type, things like that. So we can see that our mental shortcuts can reinforce cultural and individual bias. They get reproduced, they harden into oftentimes what we believe is fact. Now this process itself is neutral. It's what the brain does to reduce its load of having to relearn things all the time. But when it relates to real world consequences, such as making assumptions about someone's education level based on a vocal accent, we can see how difficult these shortcuts can be. So learning about heuristics and representative heuristics can lead us to a little bit of a more nuanced understanding of implicit bias. So implicit bias is a term that we use to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes to those people without our conscious knowledge. A fairly commonplace example is seen when studies show that white people, for example, will frequently associate criminality with black faces without even realizing they're doing that. So related to implicit bias, if you're interested in learning more about this, it's a fascinating rabbit hole to go down, and you yourself can take an implicit association test and compare your scores, your biases, with broader ones of our society. We see over and over again with this study of the initiative of implicit bias, or the Project Implicit, that research using this IAT, that acronym, demonstrate that many of us carry negative stereotypes subconsciously, even if we believe at a conscious level that we don't. So we see how those neural pathways practice bias again and again, and how that can lead to difficulties and assumptions beyond our conscious knowledge if we are trying to reach across in dialogue. So evidence of strong cultural bias deeply ingrained, even if we believe that we are unbiased. Remember, once a belief is in place, it's difficult to change it. And if it's reinforced not only by you, but also your broader culture, it's even more ingrained and invisible. The good news is that we need not resign ourselves to tribalism. Research suggests that we have the capacity to override even our most primal of instinct, sometimes our worst instinct. And what we can do is we can become aware of our worldviews and our biases. And more importantly, we can make conscious, intentional choices about our communication behavior with others. And the more we reinforce those, the more they become our stronger impulses. Finally, let's take a look at the concept of empathy and how we can use it as an effective dialogue strategy for building bridges across lines of difference in our dialogues. Folks, I could explain empathy, but I'd rather hand it over to someone who does such a better job in her eloquence. This video, it was initiated by Brene Brown. very famous professor and researcher of social work down at the University of Texas in Austin, who focuses a lot of her work on vulnerability. So please enjoy this video that defines empathy, compares empathy to sympathy, and they're oftentimes confused as synonyms. As we'll see by this video, they should not be. Let's look at a few examples of empathetic responses that you might use during a difficult conversation or dialogue. So we want to focus on nonverbal communication and using our body as a symbol or verification that we are involved and engaged and interested, and we're not planning on going anywhere immediately. So we want to use our whole body to show that we're listening. And that means that if you are oriented in a different direction, you get up and move your chair or your desk so that you can be looking and facing the person. Or if they're speaking very softly and you can't hear, to politely pause them and ask them to speak up so that you can hear them. We also want to focus on sharing the airtime as an act of empathy. Don't feel, again, like that quote said, that you have to share every good thought or idea that arises in you. Sometimes it's best to feel that idea brew and let it pass. When crafting your reply to someone, make sure you're not trying to do these things. And I take this from Parker Palmer, famous educator and author, who writes about authentic sharing and engagement in dialogue. Don't try to fix them, save them, advise them, or set them straight. That's not the goal of the dialogue. And oftentimes it helps to bring that context to mind. What is my purpose here? Is it to learn, to understand, to empathize? And that helps bring us back on track. There's a great question I come back to and advise my students again and again. Tell me what that's like for you. Again, it centers this on the other and offers that empathy, curiosity. And if possible, use strategies of reflective or active listening. This is listening so well you can paraphrase what they said back to them as an act of clarification. So there you have it, folks. A little bit of information regarding worldview, bias, empathy, and empathetic strategies. Again, we know that social sensitivity is possible through awareness of our own worldviews and biases, and awareness that other people are complex individuals who have their own worldviews and biases. And then, of course, acknowledging that we and others are complex people. We have lots of great ideas, but oftentimes we set ourselves up for greatest success in connection and authentic connection when we take the listening role. Curiously listening about others, and of course using empathy as an effective communication and dialogue strategy when we're trying to connect humanely across difference. Thank you.